Before we begin, I'd like to recognize a few dignitaries who are in the audience besides our honorees, some of whom have received our Speaker of the Truth Award in previous years. First of all, the Honorable Jim Woolsey, former director of the CIA, a wonderful friend. Speaking of wonderful, close personal friends, Cal Thomas, and thank God he is the nation's widest syndicated columnist. Congressman Stockman, I see you just come in. Yay! Thank you so much. Okay, Congressman Doug Lamborn of Colorado. Yay! A great friend and a great friend of Israel. I don't know if he's arrived yet, but Congressman Trent Franks of Arizona is going to be sitting right here at table 4. A few guests had said they were coming, but they're being held up by votes. Congressman Doug Collins of Georgia, Congressman Ron DeSantis of Florida, Congressman Cory Gardner of Colorado, and Representative Bill Posey of Florida. Also, I'd like to welcome here with us tonight a dear friend and the former Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the Honorable Tevi Troy. Right. Noted advisor to former Vice President Richard Cheney and UN Ambassador John Bolton, David Wormser. Noted author and journalist Stephen Coughlin. Ambassador Ellie Groner of the Economic Affairs Department, our Director of the Department of Economic Affairs of the Israeli Embassy. Colonel Itzhak Elimelech and his beautiful wife Naomi of the Israeli Embassy. Colonel Mati Alejam of the Israeli Embassy. Ambassador Paul Altidore of Haiti. Ambassador Alin Salamonov from Azerbaijan. Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital and best-selling author Dr. Ben Carson. And Egyptian dissident and courageous speaker of the truth, Cynthia Farahat. A few other people I'd like to recognize here tonight. Eitan Leor, who is like a brother to me, of the American Principles. Ken Abramowitz, chairman of the American Friends of Likud. Noah Pollack of the Emergency Committee for Israel. Len Leader, chairman of the board of the Israel Project. Dick Hellman from CPAC, the Christian Pro-Israel Public Affairs Committee. Reverend General Jim Hutchins of the U.S. military and of the Jerusalem Connection, and his beautiful white Pat. Bruce Fitzgerald from CUFI, Christians United for Israel. Yay, CUFI. Helen Friedman of Americans for a Safe Israel. Judge Mark Carden of the ZOA. And Ashraf Ramallah of Voice of the Cops. And please, please forgive me if I left anyone out who should be noted. Every single one of you who is in this room tonight is a VIP to me. All right, just taking a cursory look around the Middle East, we see a region which, in the last 3 years, has begun imploding, and we're witnessing a vortex of events. It's throwing off the straight lines that were drawn after World War I by European colonialists, lines that were rather arbitrarily and hastily thrown together. And now we see a region that's becoming more sectarian, more primordial, and we're witnessing 14th century old religious rivalries that have been festering for 14 centuries now coming into the fore. We're seeing the rapid ascent of radical Islam and of internecine Sunni versus Shiite religious rivalries. In Syria, we see approximately 100,000 people being brutally massacred at the hands of their own fellow Muslim co-religionists. We see Putin's Russia trying to flex its muscles and become a world superpower again, and inserting itself in its characteristically cowardly fashion via proxy into the internecine Muslim civil war in Syria, bringing the Cold War back into the Middle East, along with its battery of advanced S-300 anti-aircraft missiles and UDAV anti-submarine missile systems. In Egypt, we see that after 34 years and over $50 billion of American military assistance, people have gone to the polls and voted in an extremist Muslim Brotherhood government, which is rapidly spiraling towards massive economic disaster and famine. We see a government which at best stands by and does nothing, and at worst assists as its Coptic Christian community, as well as other minority groups, are assaulted and murdered and are being denied the most basic of human rights. We watch as American NGOs are either kicked out of the country and sentenced to jail in absentia or are hauled off to jail in handcuffs, and as more open-minded members of the media are stripped of their jobs and also hauled off to court and sometimes are imprisoned. Turkey, whose Islamist Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan seized power in 2004, has put an end to the decades of peace and tranquility that both Israel and the United States enjoyed with the Turkish Revolution as a result of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. This huge, highly polarized nation is now convulsing with a secular backlash and is being engulfed in flames. The Iranians just went to the polls this past weekend and elected what the world is now hailing as, quote, the Great White Hope, a great moderate, a reformer. Who exactly is this Hassan Rouhani? Please, I ask you, harbor no illusions. This person has been a member of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps since its inception. He has been fully vetted and approved by Ayatollah Khomeini and was a friend of the past Ayatollah Khomeini, and is in with his reigning mullahs. As Barry Rubin writes, quote, if there was a regime maneuver to suddenly portray Iran as moderate, it is working. Around the globe, media outlets are now reporting that Iran has transformed, and now it is time to show patience and make concessions, unquote. Please, I ask you, do not delude yourselves. There is absolutely no disagreement across the political spectrum in Iran. They all want to become a nuclear power. As last May's IAEA report states, the rapidly spinning Iranian centrifuges have been making steady progress towards their inevitable goal of becoming a nuclear power and of, quote, wiping Israel, the minor Satan, off the map, which, as you know, is just a milestone on their journey to eliminating the great Satan, the United States. The Iranians are seeking hegemony not only of the region, but of the world. And we Jews, with our long, sad, and painful history, have had to learn that when people talk about exterminating us, we have got to listen to what they say and take what they say at face value. Meanwhile, not a day goes by when the Palestinians are not educating their children towards the virtues of being a shaheed or shahidah, a martyr, or teaching them that one day they will return to their grandfather's orchards and vineyards in Haifa, and that all of pre-1967 Israel will one day be theirs. Israel has always maintained that it will sit down with the Palestinians without preconditions, yet the Palestinian Authority refuses to sit down and negotiate with Israel without preconditions. Suddenly, Secretary of State John Kerry is now in the region with a renewed sense of urgency, saying that the proverbial window of opportunity will be forever closed once again if Israel does not make peace immediately with the Palestinians. The Secretary of State has dusted off and is trying to repeddle the Saudi plan, which is replete with preconditions imposed on Israel. It dictates to Israel that it must return to the indefensible 1948 armistice lines, which Abba Eban of the Labor Party had dubbed the Auschwitz lines because they are so indefensible. The Saudi plan, or the Arab Initiative, dictates that Jerusalem must be divided. It dictates the right of return of millions of Palestinian refugees who are the descendants of a few thousand who, by the way, were asked to leave their homes by their leaders, who would flood into the area and totally alter the Jewish and democratic nature of the state. Israel is now being expected to accept all of this simply for the privilege of being able to sit down at the table and talk to people who can't even manage to get out of their throats without choking and recognize Israel for what it is, the Jewish state. I ask you, now, with all this instability in the region surrounding them, is this the right time to whittle down our one stable, independent, democratic ally in the Middle East? Is it because the withdrawals from Lebanon in May of 2000 or the withdrawals from Gaza the summer of 2005 have brought such peace and tranquility to their borders? Ladies and gentlemen, we at AMET are proud to tell you that we, as opposed to the foreign policy establishment here in Washington and some other pro-Israel groups here in Washington, have the courage to ask the unpopular questions, such as whether or not the last 20 years of Oslo and the Land for Peace paradigm has actually gotten us any closer to that goalpost of peace, whether or not it might be time, in fact, to go back to the drawing board and to say this is the null hypothesis and rip it up. Whether or not our $1.5 billion in military assistance to Egypt or our $500 million of annual military aid to the PA has brought either of these any closer to our democratic values. Whether or not the time for sanctions and diplomacy with Iran is long gone, and whether or not when President Obama says all options are on the table, he really means all options are on the table. Or is this simply a nice rhetorical turn of phrase during an election season? We're proud that there does exist one tiny little state in the Middle East that, in these years of economic decline, is enjoying a thriving economy, that is the world's capital of high-tech and monumental advancements in medicine and pharmacology, that it is a beacon of human rights, religious freedom, and democratic values, that it has Arab members of Knesset, and that despite the fact that they use their platform in the Knesset to speak out against the government of Israel will protect and defend their right to do so. That is taking victims of the brutal civil war in Syria and bringing them into Israeli hospitals for life-saving procedures. That it routinely saves the lives of Arab and Muslim children in highly sophisticated, delicate operations through such great organizations as Save a Child's Heart Foundation, and whose actions in the face of ongoing wars and terrorism, according to Richard Kemp, Colonel Richard Kemp of the British Royal Armed Forces, are among the most moral and humane in the world. Says Colonel Kemp, and he said this on the floor of the United Nations, I challenge any nation on the face of the earth who is confronted with the same sort of daily ongoing threats to its very existence as the State of Israel to act in as moral and as judicial a way as the State of Israel. Yet, in this Orwellian age, no other nation is as subject to as many condemnations from the floor of the United Nations, to as many efforts of international boycott and divestment, to as much bile and vitriol on university campuses and on the floor of the United Nations and throughout the world as this tiny little nation of Israel. Think of it. This little nation that has served as a beacon of hope for my people throughout generations of persecution, of dimitude, of humiliation, and culminating in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. This little nation who refugees throughout Africa who are being subjugated by other Muslims because they have more black pigment in their skin clamor to get into because they know it will protect their human rights. This little tiny nation receives more international condemnation than such human rights abusers as North Korea, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Iran combined. On the domestic front, we in fact, most Americans have come to these shores seeking religious freedom. We believe that our Constitution is the most precious document ever written by man, which protects these religious liberties. But there are some who are using that very document, the Constitution, as a smokescreen to hide behind as they conduct a stealth jihad here in America and insert themselves into positions of power within our government. There are some, but not all, within the Muslim community who would have taken it upon themselves to establish a worldwide caliphate, and that they would like to subordinate our constitutional freedoms to the domination of Sharia law. And we have got to understand that this poses a threat to us just as much in our time as the great ideological threats of communism and Nazism did in our parents' generation. We cannot, and we will not, in the name of political correctness, moral relativism, or even religious sensitivity, allow the erosion of our constitutional freedoms. We at Emet are proud that we are the first Jewish pro-Israel organization who has taken it upon itself to say thank you to those incredibly courageous Muslims, former Muslims, Persians, or Arabs who have risked everything, including their very lives, and exclusion from family and friends and community, to speak the truth about the Islamist assault on Western civilization as we know it. These people, such as Reza Khalili, who we'll have the privilege of hearing from tonight, should be awarded, praised, and feted for their unparalleled courage. They have managed to penetrate down through the layers and layers of societal bias and hatred and reach down to what makes all of us human. I do not know if I were in their place, if I would be as courageous. They are among the very best specimens that humanity has to offer. And we are proud tonight to honor those who have dared to think outside of the box, who dare to stand with Israel, who dare to stand for the cause of human freedom and to stand against the mounting forces of radical Islam. We are proud to have with us today such heroes in the struggle as Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat, and Mrs. Annette Lantos, who will accept the award in memory of the late Congressman Tom Lantos. Representative Jeff Duncan from South Carolina. Yay. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. Woo! Bret Stephens of the Wall Street Journal. And of course, our wonderful speaker of the truth, Reza Khalili.